Hey everyone, it's Smear, and I'm coming at you with another video. Again, we're gonna tie in with the series of mechanics we'd like to see back in Street Fighter 6, and today we'd like to talk about our good old friend, the Dragon Punch, which I will just refer to as DP for short from now on. Specifically, one of the many controversies which Street Fighter 5 was involved in, which was the removal of meterless invulnerable DPs, which you might have heard of in the past. But, what does that mean exactly, you ask? My character doesn't even have a DP, so why should I care? Some characters only have EX reversals, so what about them? Well, I'll get to it. But first, let's look at the old Street Fighter titles to have an idea why this case is an oddity. Traditionally, in many Street Fighter games, DP style moves were completely invulnerable to attacks for very moments of time. In original Street Fighter 1, they were invulnerable for the entire duration, in fact, and if it weren't for the complete lack of input leniency or buffers, you could just chain one after the other and be invulnerable forever, so that kind of tells you the standards of balance that we were abiding to back then. Street Fighter 2 and Alpha have DPs that are invulnerable at least until the active frames, so that means that they will reliably hit without getting hit first, and different versions of the move usually have different amounts and have different startup and duration. Street Fighter 3 is a little bit of an exception to this rule. Ever since Super Turbo, super moves have been a big part of the game, and meter was only reserved to those, but in Street Fighter 3 they added EX moves, and those let you spend bar to enhance one of your special moves. Because of the presence of EX moves, many DPs got full invulnerability only with meter expenditure. The notable exception being Akuma, because he doesn't have any EX moves, so his DPs are always invulnerable. Street Fighter 3, however, works in a very different way than many of the other main Street Fighter titles, especially because everyone has access to a one-frame parry that the game is so well known for, and so we can kind of write this game off as that weird one in the arcade. Street Fighter 4 went back to the traditional style with meterless invulnerable DPs. The EX versions of the DP usually had more invulnerability or better range, startup damage, that sort of thing. On top of that, with the focus attack dash cancel system that would cost 2 of your 4 EX bars, you could turn a DP into either an opportunity for more damage or a safe option on defense, so that was pretty important. This brings us to Street Fighter 5. In case you aren't aware, Street Fighter 5 actually didn't start with meter-only invulnerable DPs, but it had meterless invulnerable DPs in Season 1. This was changed at the end of Season 1 and beginning of Season 2 with the first big balance patch. So, why the change? I mean, it seems pretty odd considering that basically every game had invulnerable DPs. Well, let's look at the pros and cons of either system so we can finally dissect the issue. First, the traditional invulnerable DP system. The first notable advantage of the meterless DP is that it doesn't cost any meter, and this means that you always have access to it, so you can save bar for other EX moves or for supers. DPs reliably beat any kind of attack, which means they're great for defense. This allows you to mesh out of pressure and beat multiple options at the same time. This is especially true if they're invulnerable immediately. They are a powerful reversal, although very punishable, especially in Street Fighter 5 because of the crash counter system. Opponents have to respect your DP basically every time you wake up or when they're pressuring you. Invulnerable DPs are great anti-airs because they're very reliable, again because they're invulnerable. They're the crux of the Shoto gameplay, right? They throw a fireball and they DP you if you jump. And you also get a lot of choice on the version, as they're all invulnerable somehow. You also get some extra design freedom, as the XDPs can have special properties, as they're not relegated to being the only invulnerable version. Finally, you get more variety in characters with or without DP, or as a meter-only reversal. As far as cons, there's fewer, but I would say they're very impactful ones. Characters with DPs have a very powerful tool as opposed to characters that only have meter-only reversals or no DP at all. These characters always have answers thanks to the DP itself. And although you still have to perform the input, which could be difficult in a pinch, based on the system mechanics, this can give you a huge advantage, especially in a game like, for example, Street Fighter 4, where you had the FADC system that I mentioned earlier, or in Street Fighter 5, where there's limited defensive mechanics, and so having this extra defensive mechanic is very, very valuable. As mentioned before, this also means that you always have access to a reversal, which means that your opponent never really has guaranteed offense. Keep in mind that since the DP is meterless, that means you can do stuff like DP into super as well, and this can turn a desperate reversal into a lot of damage depending on the character, even make it safe in some cases. Again, this point is very important in a game with limited defensive options like Street Fighter V at release. Since offense was very strong, this gave the characters with DPs an edge on defense. Sometimes just because people didn't want to eat a damaging uppercut, they would just let you breathe on defense, and that's really valuable. Well, eventually Street Fighter V made the change to the different system that we have now for these specials. Now, only the DPs that are fully invulnerable from frame 1 are the EX ones. In some special cases, there might be unique versions available in V-Trigger, like for example Akuma, but for the most part it's just the EX ones. To make sure that every normal DP still had IQs, however, each individual version was given unique properties to compensate. For example, a dedicated version specifically invulnerable to airborne attacks is usually the medium version. You have one that is projectile immune most often, you have one that is invulnerable to throws, sometimes you have one that is invulnerable to strikes, although that's not frame 1, it can also be thrown before it is airborne. So how's this system better or worse than the previous one? Well, for one, you have a more well-defined series of DPs. You know exactly the purpose of every individual version, so you can use them each for the proper situation. Before, some versions were basically unused because they didn't have any special property that made them desirable. So this overall gives us more variety that is not just range, startup, or damage. It also prevents people from being able to easily mesh out of pressure for no meter investment. This means that this is both during strings or on wake up. And although it is natural to bait them on offense, it's always a thought that has to be in the back of your head. Your opponent has a DP, they can use it any time. On top of that, some characters with reactable gaps in their strings, like during fireball pressure or when using slow moves, would never be truly safe to use these moves against a character that had a DP because they would just get smacked in the face. But if the DP costs a bar, at least they are not completely shut down because the opponent has to spend meter to stop them, and it's not just a get out of jail free card, as these resources are not infinite. It also equalizes the cast, making characters with DPs not have such a big advantage over characters that don't have one. They still have more utility than a character with no reversal, but at least it's not such a night and day difference. Obviously there's also some very apparent negatives for this system as well. Because every version has a purpose, you usually tend to only have one DP that works in a very specific situation. So if that happens to be the wrong kind of DP, like for example it's too short or it's too slow, it can be a problem. The most notable example would be anti-airing. You might want a light DP because it's very short and vertical to beat someone that's flying over your head with a cross-up, but that is not its intended purpose maybe, and then it will trade or outright lose when you cross-cut it on the other side, for example. Some particular moves can create some problems with these very specific DPs. For example, stuff like Alex's head crush or Birdie's dolphin dive, although they look like air attacks, they're technically throws. So if you accidentally use the non-throw invulnerable version of your DP slightly too late, then you're just gonna get grabbed. And some airborne moves become grounded as they hit the opponent, so an anti-air only DP can be beat if it is too late. So if you want to beat these moves 100%, at the end of the day you still have to spend a bar to do your EX DP. And then traditional style system, this wouldn't be an issue because you could just use a normal DP just fine. Now, regardless of whether you like it or not, this is the system that we have in Street Fighter V right now. And I feel like at this point it's worth mentioning the leadership behind the development of the game. Although nothing is confirmed, that's a very fair assumption to say that every balance change has to be greenlit by the battle director, as after all he's the one that is in charge of these kind of things. And the battle director for Street Fighter V is a man named Woshige. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Woshige, he used to be a Guilty Gear Pro player, so it's very possible that his past experiences with those games influenced his decisions for balancing Street Fighter V. Guilty Gear, after all, is a game where there's a bunch of DP style moves that are not actually completely invulnerable, so there might be some truth to this assumption. Speaking of past experiences, let's look at some footage of Woshige so you get to know him better.
Gets caught low again, has to burst immediately.
Full meter though, full meter! He's gonna have to do, oh he can't, no burst!
So smart!
Oh my
so
God!
smart!
Genius!
So smart, he couldn't burst because of the super. But Woshige thinks it's over!
Lock down,
He
oh
won
my
the last
God!
round!
What a
And the
shot!
round one doesn't
What a
care!
shot!
He still got 65%!
Oh my God!
Woshige, no!
Woshige, not like this! What are you
What
standing
are you
up for?
standing up for?
Why? Why?
Oh my God! Washiga thought it was over and stood up, and Ogawa gave him no remorse.
That is exactly what happens. Do not celebrate you with pop off.
Oh my God!
And then they hired him. Well, let's draw some conclusions now. I personally don't feel strongly about the matter. Both systems have a fair few advantages and disadvantages that are fairly balanced against each other. Although I side more towards the new style of metered and vulnerable DPs, as I don't really like how you have to worry about DPs all the time, so matchups where you're on offense, and then in other matchups you don't have to worry about it at all, and in cases of some characters, they get really shut down by vulnerable moves. So I'd rather prefer this method where the experience is a little bit more normalized, streamlined, if you will. All in all, it really depends on the system that is built around it, as with the right adjustments, either versions could work very well in Street Fighter 6. Most importantly, I think we don't know if the new battle director for Street Fighter 6 will be biased towards either of these choices. We don't know if it's still Washiga or whoever else, as these choices don't really matter towards balance all that much, because like I said, you can work around them. This is probably the biggest deciding factor. Well, having said all this, let me know in the comments what you think. Do you think that invulnerable DPs should be coming back in Street Fighter 6, or do you have any idea on how they could be implemented instead? As always, make sure to sub to the channel for more videos like these, and click the notification bell to be alerted when new content comes out. And I'll just see you all next time.